Hi there. Let your mind slow down and relax your body. We aim to be calm and peaceful. And please, in the comments, write down your best help for sleeping and let me know where you are from. And never forget that you are loved and important in this world to somebody. You are unique and we love you. The Man in the Forest. When I was a kid growing up in Bulgaria, my parents often took me to the local parks on weekends. They weren't like the sprawling city parks you might imagine, but long, narrow stretches of greenery that followed a river or nestled against the edge of the town. This particular park ran parallel to a creek and was bordered by a dense, dark forest. Beyond the forest, cliffs loomed, making it impossible to wander too far off the path. I wasn't fond of this park. It felt like the sort of place where bad things happened, though I couldn't have said why. Maybe it was the way the trees tangled together, blocking out most of the light, or the ever-present hum of insects and rushing water that made it feel isolated. But my parents loved it, and on this particular summer day, they brought me and some family friends along for a long walk. The adults talked endlessly about grown-up things I couldn't care less about, their conversation filling the air as we ambled along the path. I was bored, so bored that I decided to run ahead of them, weaving between the trees and sticking to the trail that hugged the creek. My sneakers slapped against the uneven dirt, and soon their voices faded behind me. I wasn't worried. I knew they would catch up. The path was a straight shot, no way to get lost. But as the noise of the group faded, I became acutely aware of the quiet around me. The creek's gurgle felt sharper, the rustling leaves louder. That's when I heard it, the crunch of branches snapping underfoot. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. The sound wasn't far off, coming from the forest to my right. I turned my head toward the noise, expecting to see a deer or a stray dog, but there was nothing. Just the dense tangle of bushes and shadows. Another crunch. Closer this time. "Hello?" I called out, my voice wavering. No answer, just the faint rustle of movement. My pulse quickened. I started to back away, glancing over my shoulder toward the path behind me. It was empty. The adults were too far back to see or hear me. I was alone. Then I saw him. He emerged from the trees in a flash of movement, his lanky frame bounding through the underbrush. He was a man, maybe in his 40s, with long, greasy hair tied back with a headband. His clothes were strange, half camouflage, half civilian, like he had cobbled them together from whatever he could find. Slung across his back was an air rifle. For a moment, I froze, my mind struggling to make sense of the sight. Why was he here? Hunting wasn't allowed in the park, and besides, there was no game to hunt, just birds and the occasional fox. He shouldn't have been there. He shouldn't have been running straight at me. My legs finally remembered how to move. I turned and bolted, my shoes slipping on the loose dirt as I sprinted back toward the direction I'd come. The man yelled something, his voice hoarse and guttural, but I didn't look back. I didn't want to see how close he was. "Mom! Dad!" I screamed, the words tearing from my throat. The sound of my own voice terrified me, as if calling for help made the situation real. My heart pounded in my chest, my lungs burning as I pushed myself to go faster. Up ahead, I saw them. My parents and the family friends were walking leisurely, oblivious to the danger. "Mom!" I shrieked again, and this time they turned. Their expression shifted from confusion to alarm as they saw me barreling toward them. Behind me, the man slowed to a stop. I glanced back, breathless, as he stood there on the trail, his hands on his knees as if catching his breath. He looked up at me, then at the group, and started shaking his head. "What's going on?" my dad demanded, stepping forward to block me from the man's view. I thought he was in trouble," the man stammered, pointing at me. "I was just trying to help." His words didn't make sense, but my dad wasn't buying it. "Get out of here," he said firmly, his voice low and threatening. The man hesitated, then muttered something under his breath and slinked back into the trees. My dad's arm tightened protectively around my shoulders as we watched him disappear into the forest. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the moment he had emerged from the woods, the wild look in his eyes as he charged at me. My parents reassured me it was just a misunderstanding, but even at that age, I knew better. The man hadn't been trying to help. He had been chasing me. For what reason? I didn't want to know. To this day, I can't walk near the edge of a forest without looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see him there, waiting. The chase through the dormitory. The dormitory was nestled on the edge of a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place where streetlights cast long shadows and the silence of the night pressed heavily against the walls. It was a strange location for a student residence, isolated and out of the way, surrounded by houses filled with families and retirees. I had been living there for 2 years, long enough to grow used to its quirks and late-night walks through its empty streets. It was exam season, and the weight of my studies had taken its toll. I was running on a mix of caffeine and sheer determination, my nights consumed by textbooks and Red Bull. That night, the craving hit me out of nowhere, a desperate, unshakable need for stroopwafels. The sweet, sticky caramel was all I could think about. By 1:30 a.m., the urge was unbearable. My roommates were asleep, and the halls were silent except for the occasional creak of old floorboards. I decided to make the short walk to the ATB, a 24-hour market, just 10 minutes away. I didn't think twice about the time or the darkened streets. I had done this before. The dorm doors locked after midnight, so I had to buzz the administration to let me out. A grumpy lady cracked the door open, glaring at me as if I'd disturbed her personal sanctuary. "Be quick," she muttered, her tone making it clear she didn't want to be bothered again. Outside, the air was warm, but carried an edge of unease, the kind of stillness that amplifies every sound. I lit a cigarette, its glow the only light on the empty sidewalk, as I slipped my headphones into my ears and let music drown out the quiet. The ATB was just across the main road. To get there, I had to take an underground passage that tunneled beneath the busy street, a convenience during the day but an eerie, hollow echo chamber at night. As I approached the passage, I noticed a man standing at the nearby bus stop. He was tall and lean, dressed plainly in a dark hoodie and jeans. His posture was unnerving, rigid and deliberate, his face shadowed under the dim streetlights. There hadn't been any buses for hours, and none would come until morning. So why was he there? He noticed me. His head turned sharply, and his eyes locked onto mine. A slow, deliberate nod followed. I nodded back instinctively, though the hairs on my neck prickled with unease. I glanced away quickly, pretending to focus on the cigarette in my hand as I descended into the underground passage. The sound of my footsteps echoed hollowly, each step a reminder of how alone I was. The music in my ears felt distant now, a weak buffer against the tension gnawing at my gut. I forced myself to keep walking, focusing on the light at the end of the tunnel. When I emerged on the other side, I glanced back. The man was still at the bus stop, his figure silhouetted against the glow of a street lamp. He hadn't moved. I tried to shake off the feeling of his stare and made my way to the store, grabbing the Stroop waffles and heading straight to the self-checkout. The walk back was quiet. Too quiet. The man at the bus stop had left, or so I thought. My eyes scanned the empty street as I approached the underground passage again, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing. I descended into the tunnel, the air colder now, carrying the faint smell of damp concrete. Halfway through, I heard it. The soft scuff of a shoe against the ground. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. Slowly, I turned my head. He was there, standing at the entrance of the tunnel. I didn't think. I ran. The Stroop waffles slipped from my hands as I bolted up the stairs on the other side, my heartbeat thundering in my ears. His footsteps followed, heavy and fast, closing the distance between us. I didn't dare look back. By the time I reached the dorm, I was gasping for air, my legs burning with every step. I slammed my hand against the buzzer, frantically pressing it until the grumpy lady finally opened the door. I stumbled inside, locking it behind me, and collapsed against the wall. For hours, I stayed awake, watching the door and listening for any sound that might signal he had followed me. The night stretched on, every creak of the building twisting my nerves tighter. The man never appeared again, but for weeks after, every shadow outside the dorm felt like him. Every glance from a stranger felt too long, and I never walked through that underground passage alone again. The man in the blue truck. It was a bright, sunny afternoon, and school had just let out for the day. My brother Alex and I stepped off the bus, our backpacks heavy with homework. We wouldn't start until later. The walk home was short, just 7 minutes down a quiet residential street lined with old oak trees and well-manicured lawns. It was routine, mundane even, but that day, something felt off. The first sign was the blue and silver pickup truck. It passed us as we walked, its engine rumbling low and steady. I barely noticed it at first, too busy laughing at something Alex had said, but then the truck came back, rolling down the street toward us again, this time slower. I turned to look as it passed, catching a glimpse of the driver's face. A man with short, messy hair and a blank expression. The truck disappeared around the corner, and I shook off the unease settling in my stomach, but it wasn't long before it returned, crawling up the street once more, as if searching for something, or someone. "Alex?" I said quietly, gripping his hand tighter. He looked up at me, confused. "Let's walk faster." We picked up the pace, our sneakers crunching against the gravel along the side of the road. The truck had vanished again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still nearby, watching. My eyes darted toward every side street and driveway as we walked, scanning for any sign of movement. When we reached the intersection near our house, I saw it. The truck was back, sitting at the end of the cul-de-sac. It was idling now, its engine rumbling softly as the driver stared out toward the main road. He hadn't seen us yet, hidden as we were behind a tall hedge. "Don't ask questions," I whispered to Alex, my voice trembling. "Just run." He nodded, and we took off, sprinting across the intersection and down our long gravel driveway. The row of pine trees and bushes lining our property felt like a shield, but I knew it wouldn't be enough if he decided to follow. I glanced back just in time to see the truck accelerating down the road, heading straight for our driveway. My heart leapt into my throat. He had seen us. "Faster!" I yelled, pulling Alex along as his shorter legs struggled to keep up. The truck roared up the driveway, stopping just short of the house as we ducked into the bushes along the side. My hand clamped over Alex's mouth to muffle his sobs as we crouched low, trying to stay out of sight. The truck door creaked open, and I heard heavy boots crunching on the gravel. My heart raced as I peeked through the foliage, catching a glimpse of the man stepping into our yard. He was tall and thin, his jeans ripped at the knees, and a torn baseball cap perched on his head. He scanned the yard slowly, his eyes narrowed in concentration. I held my breath as he walked closer to the bushes, his boots inches from where we hid. Alex's tiny frame trembled against me, and I tightened my grip on him, silently willing him to stay quiet. The man muttered something under his breath, words I couldn't make out, and turned toward the house. He climbed the front steps, his hand resting on the doorknob as he tried to open it. Locked. I silently thanked our grandmother for always reminding us to lock up before leaving for school. He stepped back, scratching his head in frustration. For a moment, he seemed to hesitate, his gaze flicking back toward the bushes where we were hiding. My blood ran cold. Did he see us? I clenched my fists, ready to make a run for it, when he finally turned and walked back toward his truck. He climbed in, slamming the door shut, and drove away slowly, his brake lights glowing red as he stopped at the end of the driveway. We waited, our breaths shallow and quiet, until the sound of the engine faded completely. Then, without a word, I grabbed Alex's hand, and we bolted toward the back door of the house. Inside, I locked the door behind us and collapsed against it, shaking as Alex burst into tears. I hugged him tightly, whispering that everything was okay, even though I didn't believe it myself. We found our grandmother upstairs, still groggy from her nap. Between sobs and frantic explanations, we told her what had happened. Her face went pale, her hand flying to her chest as she reached for the phone to call the police. The officer who arrived was kind, but serious, taking our descriptions and promising to patrol the area. "We'll find him," he said, his tone steady, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. They never did. For weeks, I jumped at every sound, every passing car. I couldn't shake the image of the man stepping out of the truck, his cold, calculating gaze as he searched for us. Even now, years later, the rumble of a truck engine sends my heart racing, a visceral reminder of how close we came to being caught. The shadow in the mirror. Working at the hotel wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. As a housekeeper, I had seen more than my fair share of bizarre things, guests leaving behind personal items that told stories they probably didn't want anyone to know, strange stains on furniture that no cleaning product could fix, and even the occasional drunken guest still passed out when I arrived to clean their room. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for what happened in room 215. It was a slow afternoon, and I was making my way through my assigned rooms, checking each one off my list. When I got to 215, it was marked as occupied. No big deal. I grabbed fresh linens from my cart and knocked on the door. "Housekeeping," I called out, my voice echoing faintly in the quiet hallway. There was no response. I knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. Normally, I'd assume the guest was out, but something felt off. The hallway was unusually still, the kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes you hyper-aware of every sound. Following protocol, I slid my keycard into the lock and pushed the door open. The first thing that hit me was the smell. It wasn't the standard stuffy room odor or even the faint whiff of body spray I usually encountered. No, This was stale, heavy cigarette smoke, the kind that clung to walls and furniture, refusing to leave. It shouldn't have been there. The hotel had a strict no-smoking policy. "Hello?" I called into the room, stepping inside hesitantly. The air felt heavier than it should, the kind of weight that makes your skin prickle. My footsteps were muffled by the plush carpet as I moved farther into the space, letting the door click shut behind me. The room was dark. The curtains were drawn tightly, blocking out all but the faintest sliver of sunlight. My eyes adjusted slowly, taking in the unmade bed, the half-empty water bottle on the nightstand, and the open suitcase spilling clothes onto the floor. It looked lived in, but untouched for a while, like someone had checked in and never fully settled. And then I saw the mirror. It hung above the dresser, large and ornate, the kind of vintage piece that felt out of place in a modern hotel. At first I thought the glass was dirty. There were smudges and streaks across the surface, faint but visible in the dim light. But as I moved closer, the smudges took shape. Words. Scrawled across the glass in jagged, uneven letters were the words, "I see you." The letters weren't just written. They were carved, etched deep into the glass. My breath caught in my throat as I stepped back, bumping into the dresser. The deep grooves in the mirror dripped faintly, as if someone had just finished carving them moments ago. My mind raced for an explanation. A prank? A disgruntled guest? But why? And how would they have done it without anyone noticing? I reached for my phone to call the front desk, but before I could dial, I heard it. A faint rustling sound coming from behind the mirror. The air in the room seemed to grow colder as I stared at the glass. The sound came again, louder this time. A scrape, like nails dragging against drywall. My heart hammered in my chest as I inched closer to the mirror, every instinct screaming at me to leave, but my curiosity pushing me forward. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding in my ears. The rustling stopped. For a moment, the room was deathly silent. Then, in the corner of the mirror, a shadow moved. Not a reflection. No, this was something behind the glass. I stumbled backward, my hand clutching the edge of the dresser for support. My eyes were locked on the shadow as it grew larger, shifting and twisting like smoke trapped in a bottle. And then it stopped. For a brief second, the mirror reflected only the room and my own pale, terrified face. But just as I turned to run, the shadow lunged forward, slamming against the inside of the glass. A scream tore from my throat as I bolted for the door, fumbling with the handle before throwing it open and stumbling into the hallway. I didn't stop running until I reached the front desk, gasping for air as I tried to explain what I had seen. The receptionist stared at me like I was crazy, but agreed to send maintenance to check the room. When I returned to the room with the maintenance worker, it was empty. The air was no longer heavy, the smell of cigarette smoke gone. The mirror was intact, its surface spotless. No words, no scratches, no shadow. They dismissed it as stress, a trick of the light. But I knew what I saw. I never went back to 215, and I avoided the second floor altogether whenever I worked. To this day, I can't look at a mirror without wondering what might be lurking just beyond the glass. The man on the bridge. It was the kind of night that felt like the world was holding its breath. The air was thick with fog, curling around the streetlights and muffling the usual sounds of the city. I had been out late, staying longer than I should have at a friend's house on the other side of town. By the time I left, the buses had stopped running, and my only option was to walk home. The quickest route took me over the old railway bridge. It wasn't my favorite path, especially at night. The bridge was notorious for its eerie atmosphere, an iron structure that groaned and creaked in the wind, with railings so rusted they seemed ready to crumble at a touch. Below, the train tracks stretched endlessly in both directions, disappearing into the mist. I pulled my jacket tighter against the chill as I started up the incline, my footsteps echoing hollowly against the metal grating. The fog was denser here, swirling around my legs and making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. I kept my head down, focusing on the path in front of me, trying to ignore the way the shadows seemed to shift in the corners of my vision. Halfway across the bridge, I heard it. Footsteps. They weren't mine. They came from somewhere ahead, faint but steady, matching my rhythm. I stopped abruptly, my heart pounding in my chest. The other footsteps stopped too. I squinted into the fog, my breath visible in the cold air. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing against my ears like a weight. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it. Then the footsteps started again, slow and deliberate, drawing closer. I felt a chill run down my spine as a figure emerged from the fog. A man, tall and thin, dressed in a dark coat. His face was partially obscured by the shadow of his hat, but there was something unnerving about the way he moved. His steps too smooth, too purposeful. I forced myself to keep walking, my eyes locked on the figure. As we neared each other, I moved to the side, giving him plenty of space to pass. But he didn't pass. He stopped, just a few feet in front of me, blocking my path. "Lost?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. The word hung in the air, heavy with implication. "No," I said quickly, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just heading home." He tilted his head slightly, as if studying me. His face was still partially hidden, but I could feel his eyes on me, sharp and unblinking. "Home's a dangerous place to be," he said, almost as if he were talking to himself. I stepped back instinctively, my hands clenching into fists at my sides. "Excuse me," I muttered, moving to walk around him. But as I stepped to the side, so did he. The fog seemed to thicken around us, the cold seeping into my bones. "It's late," he said softly, almost kindly. "You shouldn't be out here alone." "I'm fine," I snapped, my fear bubbling into anger. I moved again, more forcefully this time, and he didn't stop me. But as I passed him, I felt his eyes follow me, the weight of his gaze burning into my back. I quickened my pace, my footsteps clanging against the grating as I hurried toward the end of the bridge. The fog seemed heavier now, wrapping around me like a shroud. I glanced back once, half expecting to see the man still standing there, watching me. But the bridge was empty. Relief washed over me as I stepped off the bridge and onto the solid pavement of the street. I turned down a familiar alleyway that cut through the neighborhood, eager to put as much distance as possible between myself and that unsettling encounter. Then I heard it again. Footsteps. My heart sank as I realized they weren't coming from behind me. They were ahead, echoing softly in the narrow alleyway. I stopped in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. The figure stepped out from the shadows, his dark coat blending into the dim surroundings. It was the man from the bridge. "How?" I stammered, taking a step back. "How did you—" "You shouldn't have crossed," he interrupted, his voice as calm as ever. He took a step toward me, and I stumbled backward, my hands scraping against the rough brick wall. The bridge doesn't like when people cross it at night. "What are you talking about?" I demanded, my voice rising in panic. "What do you want?" He didn't answer. Instead, he raised one hand, pointing back toward the direction I had come. His face was clearer now, illuminated by the faint glow of a nearby streetlight. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his eyes were hollow, like dark pits that seemed to draw in the light. "Go back," he said, his voice colder now, more commanding. "Before it's too late." I didn't wait to hear more. I turned and ran, my legs burning as I sprinted down the alley and back onto the main street. I didn't stop until I reached my apartment, slamming the door shut behind me and locking every bolt. My chest heaved as I pressed my back against the door, listening for any sound outside. There was nothing. No footsteps, no voices. Just the distant hum of the city. The next morning, I woke to find a strange mark on my door, a long, jagged scratch that hadn't been there before. It looked like it had been made with something sharp, but there was no sign of anyone having been outside. I've avoided that bridge ever since. Even during the day, I can't bring myself to cross it, and on foggy nights, when the city grows quiet and the air feels heavy, I sometimes think I can hear footsteps in the distance, slow and deliberate, waiting. The knock in the night. It was just past midnight when I heard the first knock. The sound was faint but deliberate, echoing through the thin walls of my small apartment. I sat frozen on the couch, my book forgotten in my lap. The soft hum of the television, which I'd left on for background noise, now felt too loud. I muted it and strained to listen. There it was again, a slow, rhythmic knock at the door. I lived alone on the third floor of a quiet building. My neighbors were an older couple who never stayed up late, and the rest of the apartments on my floor were empty. The landlord had been trying to fill them for months. No one should have been knocking on my door, not at this hour. I rose cautiously, my bare feet silent against the worn carpet as I approached the door. My hand hesitated over the peephole. Something about this felt wrong, like whoever was on the other side knew I'd come closer. When I finally peered through, my stomach dropped. The hallway was empty. I stood there, heart pounding, staring at the dimly lit corridor. The door across from mine was closed, its faded number barely visible in the flickering overhead light. There was no one in sight. I exhaled shakily and backed away from the door, telling myself it was just my imagination. Maybe I'd dozed off and dreamed the sound. I turned the TV volume back on, trying to drown out my growing unease. Then it came again. Knock, knock, knock. This time it was louder, more insistent. My skin prickled as I froze in place, my eyes darting to the door. I grabbed my phone from the coffee table, my thumb hovering over the screen as I debated whether to call someone. The police? A neighbor? Would they even believe me? Gathering my courage, I approached the door again, this time gripping the handle tightly. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling despite my effort to sound firm. Silence. The hallway beyond the door was unnervingly quiet. No footsteps, no rustling, just the faint hum of the overhead light. My fingers tightened on the handle, and for a moment I considered unlocking it, throwing it open just to prove there was no one there. But something stopped me. A feeling, an instinct, like a warning siren blaring in the back of my mind, screaming at me to stay put. I took a step back, my heart racing, and grabbed the nearest object, a heavy lamp from the side table. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. My hands shook as I held it, my eyes fixed on the door. Knock, knock, knock. This time, it didn't come from the front door. It came from the window. I whipped around, the lamp nearly slipping from my grasp. My apartment was on the 3rd floor. There was no fire escape, no ledge wide enough for anyone to stand on. The window faced a quiet alley where nothing but dumpsters and stray cats lingered. The curtains were drawn, and I debated whether or not to pull them back. My pulse thundered in my ears as I crept toward the window, the lamp still clutched in my hand. The knocking continued, steady and deliberate, like a metronome counting down to something inevitable. I reached for the edge of the curtain, hesitating for what felt like an eternity. My breath hitched as I finally yanked it aside. Nothing. The alley below was empty, bathed in the pale glow of the streetlights. The window itself was locked, its surface clear of any smudges or marks. There was no sign of anyone or anything that could have made the noise. And yet, as I stood there, staring out into the night, the knocking began again. This time, it came from behind me. I turned slowly, every muscle in my body screaming at me to run. The sound was coming from inside the apartment now, soft, deliberate taps against the closet door in the bedroom. I stepped backward, my breath catching as the knocking grew louder. The door rattled slightly, as if something on the other side was testing the handle. My legs felt like lead, my grip on the lamp tightening until my knuckles turned white. Then, the knocking stopped. Silence filled the apartment, thick and oppressive. I waited, my chest rising and falling with shallow breaths, every nerve on edge. And then the closet door creaked open. I didn't wait to see what was inside. Dropping the lamp, I bolted for the front door, fumbling with the locks before yanking it open and running into the hallway. I didn't stop until I was outside, the cold night air stinging my skin as I gasped for breath. I spent the rest of the night at a nearby diner, surrounded by the comforting hum of other people and the bright fluorescent lights. When I finally returned to my apartment the next morning, the door was still locked, the windows untouched. Everything was exactly as I had left it, except for the closet door. It was wide open, and on the inside of the door, scratched deep into the wood, were the words, "I told you to open it." The farmhouse lights. It started when I moved into my grandparents' old farmhouse. They had passed away a few years prior, and my parents had no interest in maintaining the property. It was isolated, sitting on a few acres of overgrown fields, surrounded by dense woods. The nearest neighbor was over a mile away, and the only road leading to the house was more pothole than pavement. I wasn't thrilled about living there alone, but I had just graduated college and needed a place to stay while I figured out my next steps. The house was old and creaky, with peeling wallpaper and a persistent smell of damp earth. But it was home, for now. The first night, I noticed the lights. I had just finished unpacking and was sitting in the living room, scrolling through my phone. Outside, the wind whistled through the trees, and the occasional hoot of an owl broke the silence. The house was surrounded by darkness, with no streetlights for miles. I hadn't even bothered to hang curtains yet, figuring no one would be looking in. Then I saw it. A faint glow coming from the edge of the woods. At first, I thought it was a flashlight. Maybe someone had wandered onto the property, lost or curious. I stood and peered out the window, squinting into the darkness. The light swayed gently, like it was being carried by someone walking. "Hello?" I called out, though my voice was muffled by the glass. The light didn't stop. It moved slowly along the tree line, almost rhythmic, before disappearing into the woods. I locked the door and told myself it was probably a hunter or a kid messing around. This was the countryside, after all. People wandered. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that settled in my chest. The next night the light returned. This time, it was closer. I watched from the kitchen window as it appeared near the old barn, glowing faintly in the darkness. It wasn't the harsh beam of a flashlight. It was softer, almost golden, like the light from a lantern. It flickered slightly, casting long shadows across the overgrown grass. I stepped outside onto the porch, the wooden boards creaking under my weight. "Hey!" I shouted, louder this time. "Who's there?" The light paused. For a moment I thought whoever it was might answer. But then it began to move again, drifting toward the woods until it disappeared. I told myself not to panic. Maybe it was just a neighbor checking on the property, though I hadn't seen anyone in the 2 days I'd been there. Still, I locked every door and window before going to bed, my nerves on edge. By the third night, the light wasn't just outside. I woke up around 2 a.m. to the faint sound of footsteps. My bedroom was on the second floor, overlooking the fields. Groggy and disoriented, I sat up, listening intently. The footsteps were soft but deliberate, like someone walking across the creaky floorboards of the living room. "Hello," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The sound stopped. I climbed out of bed and grabbed the heavy flashlight I kept on the nightstand. My heart pounded as I opened the bedroom door, the hallway stretching out before me in darkness. The farmhouse had no central lighting, just old lamps scattered throughout, most of which didn't work. I stepped into the hall, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the shadows. The living room was empty. The front door was locked, just as I had left it. I checked the windows, also locked. The only sound was the faint hum of the fridge from the kitchen. Then I saw it, the light. It was inside, glowing faintly in the doorway to the kitchen. My breath caught in my throat as I watched it flicker, casting shifting shadows on the walls. It swayed gently, like it was being carried, though there was no one there. I stepped back, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The light began to move, drifting toward me. My legs felt like they were rooted to the floor, every instinct screaming at me to run, but I couldn't. I was frozen, watching as it came closer. It stopped just a few feet away. For a moment, the room was silent, save for the pounding of my heart. Then the light blinked out, leaving me in darkness. I don't remember how I made it back to my bedroom, but I must have, because I woke up the next morning curled under the blankets, the flashlight still clutched in my hand. The house was silent, the morning sun streaming through the windows. I convinced myself it had been a dream, a trick of exhaustion and stress. But when I went downstairs, I found the front door unlocked, the heavy latch dangling open. The lights continued every night after that. Sometimes they were outside, drifting through the fields or swaying near the barn. Other times, I'd wake to find them inside, glowing faintly in the corners of the rooms, just out of reach. They never made a sound, never approached me again. But their presence was constant, an unspoken reminder that I was never truly alone in that house. I stayed for 3 weeks before I couldn't take it anymore. I packed my things and left, moving into a cramped apartment in the city. The farmhouse still sits empty, its windows dark and lifeless. Sometimes when I visit my parents, I drive past it at night, and sometimes I see the lights